Let's talk about claims of cowardice then, which have been levelled against one of the country's top police officers. This is after a coroner ruled today that the man who carried out the Westminster terror attack was lawfully killed. Khalid Masood was shot dead by a minister's bodyguard in March last year after murdering 4 pedestrians and PC Keith Palmer. But after the ruling, Assistant Commissioner of the Met, Neil Basu, defended Sir Craig Mackey, who was the acting lead of the Met at the time of the attack. Sir Craig was leaving the Palace of Westminster and witnessed the killing of PC Keith Palmer, but stayed inside his car. Some have called his actions cowardice. This is what Neil Basu had said about those claims.
Can I turn to some of the abhorrent remarks circulating about Deputy Commissioner Sir Craig Mackey? I had the advantage of overseeing this inquiry, and both I and the investigators know there is nothing that Craig could have done to have stopped Masood or to have saved PC Palmer or any others from being injured. Craig was in a car accompanied by 2 civilian staff members. Neither he nor the 2 civilian staff had any protective equipment with them. The inquest heard that his initial reaction as a police officer was to get out of the vehicle, but he was told not to do so by a uniformed officer at the scene. Had he done so, it would have put Craig directly in the line of fire and prevented the protection officer from taking the shot, which stopped the terrorist once and for all. You may well think it was important for the most senior police officer in the country to be at New Scotland Yard, where he could take command and control of what at that time could potentially have been a much larger attack. Everyone involved in the terrible events that day has been left living with the painful legacy of one man's murderous actions. We must all remember who was responsible for this attack, a terrorist, and not give such people the comfort that they have somehow divided us as a result of their actions. We must all stand together and remember that it is only in standing together as a nation that we'll defeat the greatest evil of our times.
Well, the coroner himself, Mark Lovecraft QC, said Sir Craig was not to blame because he had no protective equipment, and it was clear there was nothing he could have done to stop the killer. But some people have photoshopped pictures of Sir Craig with his Queen's Police Medal replaced with a white feather. And Inspector Matt Webb, who's head of the Police Federation in Sussex, wrote a newspaper column calling for Sir Craig's resignation and for him to be stripped of his knighthood. We asked him to speak to us tonight. He won't do so. Instead, here's part of his article read by one of our producers.
I joined the police to try to make a difference. After 28 years' service, I'm still trying to do the right thing, to try to help those who are unable to help themselves. In return, I expect those above me to lead by example, to show the way. Sir Craig Mackey failed in that duty. His actions to lock himself in his police car while watching the Westminster terror attack unfold have angered and frustrated the vast majority of officers. When it becomes clear that someone, especially a fellow officer, needs assistance, it doesn't matter in what position you find yourself. That's the whole ethos of being a copper. What sort of example do the Deputy Commissioner's actions set to the officers below him? He should consider his position, not retire in December, but go now, because he does not deserve to wear the same uniform as police officers across the country. He should be stripped of his knighthood and Queen's Police Medal. No matter what he did to receive them, he has let himself and the service down with his inaction that day, and that, in the eyes of many truly brave officers, is unforgivable.
Well, that's pretty strong stuff, isn't it? Peter Kirkham is a former Detective Chief Inspector with the Metropolitan Police. Hello, Peter.
Good evening.
Good evening. And Norman Brennan's with us tonight, a former London police officer. Hello, Norman.
Yeah, good evening to you.
Hi, Norman. Well, Peter, strong stuff, but is it fair?
I think Inspector Webb makes a very valid point, and that is that police officers are expected by their senior officers to go into all sorts of situations with limited protection. We have a largely unarmed force. We have senior officers in command of firearms incidents and bladed implement incidents where the first response may not be armed officers, and they expect unarmed officers to go and visually contain those incidents and perhaps get involved in them. We have taser units
but how would it have
sent to
been...
bladed implement ones without any armed backup.
Yeah, but
so these things are expected of lower ranks by senior ranks.
Well, they may be expected in certain situations, but so how would you, if let's say he had have got out of the car, what would he have fought this man with?
I don't think the vast majority of the comments, and there have been some extreme comments, and I wouldn't seek to defend them, but I don't think the majority of people commenting are expecting him to leap out like some Superman and grapple hand-to-hand combat with a man with some knives. It may not be that he had any opportunity to do very much at all because it was all so quick and because the knife guy was on him basically before he sort of realised what would have been happening. But it's for me, it's more the response afterwards. After the threat has been neutralised, just simple humanity, not just the police thing. He has seen a colleague seriously assaulted, stabbed, and yet he leaves without even going up and seeing if he's okay, if there's anything that can be done, if everything that could be being done is being done. Even just that minute or two before getting in his car and leaving. And fair enough, he couldn't do very much at the scene. There's better equipped, better trained officers that were there within a few minutes. But just that common humanity, I think, was a mistake. And I think a failure to recognise that in the Met statement today is in danger of losing the dressing room.
You call it a lack of common humanity, but you ignore what the Chief Coroner has said. He said it is also clear that after Masood had been shot, Sir Craig did not flee the scene. His first instinct was to get out in New Palace Yard, as we saw in the footage when he opened the car door. However, he was told by an officer to leave, and for good reason. You may well think that it was important for the most senior police officer in the country to be at New Scotland Yard, where he could take command and control of what at that time could potentially have been part of a much larger attack.
Two points.
That's why he left.
2 points. He was acting commissioner. The officer that told him to get in the car and leave was a PC. Anyone that would have worked with me as a sergeant, inspector or chief inspector would tell you what my response would have been if they had told me in those circumstances. Thanks for your advice. I'll do what I like, thank you, and I'm going to do what I need to do before I leave.
But why can you not see it? Why can you not see it as logical that you need the most senior police officer commanding the situation, taking control of it?
The commissioner doesn't command anything, Stephen. I've never known the commissioner take hands-on, immediate control of any incident. If he was away in some meeting somewhere, he wouldn't have been rushed back to Scotland Yard because nobody else could deal with it. It's dealt with way below the level of commissioner, superintendents, maybe a commander level. And, they've got a role in Cobra later and all the rest of it. But 5 minutes, that's all it would have taken to totally change what he did at the scene. And that is the bit that I'm really disappointed he didn't acknowledge, that with hindsight, in retrospect, he should have done that.
08085 909 693 if you want to pick up the phone tonight. Norman?
I've got to say, I can't really disagree with anything that Peter has actually said. I think you're missing the point, and I also think, although you played devil's advocate, I also think the coroner's missing the point. There's an unwritten rule, almost like common law, that's gone throughout the whole of policing. Is you never abandon a colleague that is shot, stabbed, injured, or under attack. And Peter's absolutely right. The commissioner would not be overseeing this whatsoever. It would be a far lesser rank. Of course, they would be in their office and they would ask to be updated. The biggest mistake, as Peter rightly says, is that the most senior police officer in Britain actually witnessed one of his junior colleagues, a frontline officer, unarmed, being stabbed to death. That officer, once he knew that that particular individual, the terrorist, had been disposed of, he'd been shot, he was down, that officer, Mr. Mackey, could have got out of his vehicle. He probably would have had a first aid kit in his vehicle. That means that that first aid kit would have been the most nearest bit of first aid that that officer could have got. Even if he hung around, as Peter rightly says, for a few minutes, just reassuring the officers, letting him know, or letting all the officers know that he was there for them, the stories all of this week would be completely different. You would be talking to Peter, you would be talking to me, and millions of law-abiding public and tens of thousands of serving and retired officers wouldn't feel as disgusted as I do that in a 15 or 20 minutes, 20-second event, that Mr. Mackey's career will be remembered that he failed to act, and he was a coward. He's probably a very honourable man. I don't think he should lose his job.
But do you know what? I just wonder. And you say I'm playing devil's advocate. Actually, in a story like this, I'm not. I think this story is too important. So what I'm trying to do is to provide a sense of balance, because Mr. Mackey isn't here to stick up for himself. But I also ask of both of you, where is your sense of loyalty and camaraderie towards one of your colleagues? So what happened here was that a madman, a terrorist, was out to kill. Mr. Mackey ended up in the middle of that, and he's now being labelled a coward by you. This is one of your colleagues. What do you think? What do you think his motive was that day? What do you think Mr. Mackey's motive was that day?
What you've got to remember, Stephen, is that both Peter and myself that you're speaking to now, he's a very senior officer. He was a frontline officer. I did 31 years as a frontline officer. I was stabbed. I was attacked. In the police service, what you never ever do when you hear this sound, officer down, grade 1 call, officer requires urgent assistance. Everybody drops everything. You rush to that officer's assistance. That is what happens when that call goes up. So let me put you in our position, Stephen, is that this officer, the most senior officer in Britain, actually witnessed one of those officers that was down. And he should have, even if he remained in his car for protection, once he saw the terrorist that had been shot and disposed of, and there was no further threat, he could have stood behind an armed officer until he was sure that his safety and that of officers were safe, and then he could have then overseen the scene. He would never have investigated that business, and everybody's coming out now, not everybody, all the ACPO ranks are all coming out because they know that one of their colleagues failed at the most important time of a police officer's career. When an officer's in trouble, they failed.
So help me understand, because I don't have any knowledge of how police officers should react in a situation like this. But common sense tells me that if you are a strategist at the top of the policing situation, of the policing operation that day, that's what Mackey was. And he didn't know at that point whether this was an isolated incident or indeed whether there were going to be a number of coordinated attacks. He didn't know what was going on elsewhere in London or elsewhere in the country. So is it really logical for him to get pulled into this one isolated situation, very, very traumatic situation as it is, or actually should a leader not remove themselves from that situation in case there were a number of coordinated attacks going on throughout London or elsewhere at that moment? The point. I can't understand why that's not at least a scenario that you should give him the benefit of the doubt on, Peter.
That's because you assume that the Commissioner will take hands-on control of that incident. He won't. The Commissioner doesn't take hands-on control of anything. They might oversee, they might get updated, but hands-on control is several ranks below them.
Yeah, but the point is, if he's getting updated, then he does have a degree of responsibility.
And so spending 5 or 10 minutes at the scene, comforting Keith Palmer, who's been stabbed, reassuring the officers who are all just as shaken up as him and the 2 civilians in his car, and trying to help them deal with this situation and ensuring that everything possible is being done for Keith. And then 5-10 minutes later saying, well, there's nothing more I can do here, guys. I'm leaving you to it. I'm going back to the yard. I'll sort out everything else we need from there. That would be a totally different complexion on it. I'm certainly not calling him a coward for not diving out of the car and sacrificing himself by throwing himself at Masood. I'm not saying that he could have saved Keith's life. I don't think he could. I don't think anybody could. But what really sticks in my craw, and I think it's what really irritates and annoys and really gets police officers, is the last bit, that he then gets in the car and drives off without even checking what the situation is and that everything's being done. And it's symptomatic of something else, I think, Stephen.
But you know what? Just to stop there, and of course you can continue in a moment. But even if we take it to that point, that's not that to describe someone as a card. That's not logical. Following what you've just said,
I haven't used that word. I wouldn't use that word.
You did, Norman, right?
I did, and let me just be
because it's even if we take your thesis, if we accept what you've said, and that there's a big if around that, then that's a lack of judgment. You're calling one of your police colleagues a card. Why are you doing that? The card was Masood. That's who the card is. Khalid Masood was the card.
For sure.
Can I cut to the chase, Stephen? It doesn't matter whether you're the commissioner or a frontline PC. You are a sworn, warranted officer, and it matters not who you are, what rank, what sex you are. If a colleague is down, if a colleague is injured, if a colleague needs assistance, if other colleagues need reassured, you, whatever your rank, stay at the scene and you assist in any way whatsoever.
No matter what else would be going on within the vicinity. No matter whether there were potential bombings going on elsewhere, potential stabbings going on, no matter whether there was to be, these are all hypotheticals, a need for senior ranking officers to take an overview of the situation, you stay at the scene, do you? That does not feel logical.
There is 4 assistant commissioners or 6 assistant commissioners within the Metropolitan Police. There's 8 commanders. There are dozens of other officers that are trained and capable to deal with terrorist situations. He would not have been missed if he went missing for the rest of that week.
I just wonder what you think there is to gain, Norman, by describing one of your colleagues as a card.
There's nothing to gain. It's just my personal honest view, and it is the view of tens of thousands of serving and retired police officers. And the reason why so many high-ranking officers have come out today is because they've actually missed the point. What they've said is there's nothing he can do. Peter and I both agree with you and the coroner. There's nothing he could have done probably to have prevented PC Keith Palmer's death or that of anyone else. But what he could have done, and his duty and his responsibility, was to wait at the scene until it was safe for him to get out and do whatever he could. He would not have been a hero, but he would have been respected. And in December, when he retires from the police service with his QPM and his knighthood, he would have been remembered as someone that stayed at a scene at the most dreadful terrorist attack where a police officer and many others lost their lives and others were injured, and he stood by his men. But he didn't.
What I was saying earlier on is my concern is that it's symptomatic of something far more serious in the Metropolitan Police, and that is the gulf between the senior leadership and the front line. And it's been apparent and increasingly apparent for some time. It was starting to get a bit better under the new commissioner, but the spit guards issue, where the senior management are perceived to have left the front line at risk, took a big step back with that, and sadly this has come very quickly on the heels of that, and it sort of reinforced it. And I think that is where some of the vitriol, some of the anger, some of the disappointment, some of the feeling of being left high and dry has come from. And I really do fear morale in the Met is through the floor already before this, and I just really fear that the command team at the Met have misjudged their statement today. Of course they're going to emphasise what the Chief Coroner said about the actions of Sir Craig, But
and maybe you two shouldn't belittle or diminish what the coroner said. So there is an independent view from the coroner.
The coroner didn't make any comments about the sort of oath of constable and the unwritten law of police officers looking out for each other. The coroner's comments were about he couldn't have stopped the attack, he couldn't have detained the attacker, he couldn't have delivered first aid and saved people's lives.
I'm sorry to labour this point, but I will. Peter and Norman, you talk about colleagues looking after each other. Where's your sense of looking after Mackey? He is a colleague. Because these people go into senior management does not make them the enemy. He's a colleague.
When a colleague fails another colleague, Stephen, I've been out on the front line. I've been stabbed. And I was stabbed very shortly after I was nearly murdered beforehand. Officers from all over London, when I was stabbed, there must have been 15, 20 police cars came. And the reason why they came is because a colleague, a family member, had been stabbed or shot or seriously injured or needed urgent assistance. In the Mackey side, and please believe me, I don't know Mr. Mackey whatsoever. But what I do know is that he locked the car doors, he left the scene at an incident where he could have remained. His life wasn't at risk at the time. He was locked in his vehicle, and you keep on asking why we have no empathy with him. It's not a point with him. It's a point of the actions that he took rather than what he should have taken.
Yeah, but do you know what? But that's just not true, Norman. It is a point with him. You're both making this very personal. You in particular, Norman, you're calling a named colleague a coward. And I go back to it again. Do you really think that was his motive that day when he was sitting in that car and he was watching one of his colleagues on the ground? You really think he didn't care? From my perspective, I'm not calling him a coward. I don't know what his motive on that day was. To be honest, looking at his career trajectory through Wiltshire, 2 or 3 years in every rank, and then Gloucestershire, and then Cumbria, and then to the Met, I suspect that he might not have confronted angry men with knives all that often. So it could be the first time he's ever encountered something like that, and the only way anybody ever finds out what their reaction is going to be is when it happens to them. And some survive that, and some find they can't deal with it, and some leave the police service. I wouldn't criticise for that initial reaction, but it's the subsequent action that concerns me, and more so the comments of the Met today, which I think are badly misjudged. They're in danger of losing the dressing room. I have no beef with either of you tonight, and I appreciate you coming on, right? But I also notice that what you're not doing is you're not drawing any attention, and indeed you're both ignoring one of the facts of this case, which is that one of your police constable colleagues told him to shut the door and go. So this is not just about the actions. Even if it were to be a wrongful action that he didn't get out of the car, why aren't you two talking about one of your colleagues, one of those officers on the beat, on the ground, who was not a senior manager within the police? They told him to go. Now, why do you think they did that?
Stephen, let me tell you this, Stephen. I mean, you're not a police officer, and I appreciate your sort of backing the Deputy Commissioner. Believe you me, neither Peter or I...
I'm trying to provide a sense of balance to this.
Yeah, we don't want to be on the radio slating another police officer. We're talking about an incident. I'm telling you this, Stephen. There has been times when I've been there, an incident where a senior officer has told me not to do something, and I have seen a danger, and as a result of that, I've actually been at the risk of disciplinary action. But I took the action that I saw somebody being injured or someone potentially seriously injured, and I ignored my senior officer. At that time, he was the top boss in the country. He didn't have to take any notice whatsoever of anybody. All he had to have done was remained in his car. He was surrounded by officers and armed officers. He knew that the palace was full of officers. The only point that Peter and I are making is not to slag him off, is to say for 15 seconds, Mr. Mackey made the wrong decision.
Well, that's not what you. That's just not what you're doing.
That's exactly
Norman.
what I'm doing, Stephen.
Yeah, but it's not what you're doing, Norman. I'm sorry. You're calling him a card. So you know that's your choice to label one of your colleagues, and you know I wonder if you would do it if it was a lower ranking officer. He's still a human being. His name is being plastered all over the media. It is clear that he was given that direction, and you both still haven't addressed the point as to why. What is your view as to why one of the lower ranking officers told him not to get out of the car and leave?
Because they were no doubt rightly concerned for the safety of himself and the people in the car.
Right.
And they were saying leave, but he's the commissioner.
Were they right to tell him to leave?
There's no reason why not to. I wouldn't criticise them.
So if they were right to tell him to leave, then he surely he was doing the right thing leaving.
But we're totally ignoring the fact that the police demand of their senior officers something called leadership. And this wasn't leadership. It's not just police officers that have been criticising his actions on social media and elsewhere. It's the military. And, you know, some of them have drawn comparisons with the likes of Colonel H. Jones and such like. And can you imagine anybody that's showing that sort of leadership acting in this sort of way? Fine, he couldn't do very much whilst it's still hot, whilst it's still happening. But even if he then moves away from the immediate scene to the gates or whatever, then it's a case of, right, hang on here. Once it all becomes apparent and MPs are coming out to start giving CPR and whatever, then you go back and you spend 5 minutes. No more than that is what my expectation would be.
And Norman, you just described a situation to me where a senior officer told you to do something and you refused to follow it, right?
Yep.
What type of police officer, how safe a police officer were you when you weren't taking orders from one of your superiors? Like if police officers surely followed your lead in that type of situation, would there not be mayhem in incidents like this? And I'm not trying to be cheeky. I think it's a genuine question that you're nearly boasting tonight that what you did was you defied an order from a senior officer. Well, surely the way that we're safe in this country is that there is coordinated policing responses through a proper structure to when an incident kicks off. You're given an order and you're boasting tonight that you kind of said to your superior, stuff you, I'm doing what I want.
I'm not boasting at all. Stephen, you're speaking to a police officer or a retired police officer now.
Yes.
With 10 commendations for bravery and outstanding police work. I actually lecture to Britain on policing, law and order and victims
but
issues.
As part of that lecture, presumably you wouldn't tell people to disobey orders.
No, what I'd also say is this. Had that officer in that car, and you asked the question earlier on, Stephen, so I'll answer it now. Had that officer been a frontline PC, I would have made exactly the same comments I'm making now. And not only that, someone like Craig Mackey would have been sitting on a disciplinary board in front of that officer and probably would have dismissed him for leaving the scene when a police officer
don't know that.
I'm
sorry, you don't know that.
I'm telling you, you've asked me my view, you've given me your view, and you're entitled to yours, and you're very strong on the side of Mackey. I speak on behalf of policing, so does Peter, and not only that, we have been police officers
and
ourselves.
I get that. By the way, listen, I get it. I get it that you risk your life on the ground, and I absolutely get that, and the community in the country should be appreciative of all of the emergency forces who do that. But I do just again wonder of you, Norman, that what is your response to my question about how do you have a sense of entitlement to disobey an order of a superior, and how does that make a situation safe if other police officers were to do that?
To be fair, this was the other way around. This was a constable saying to the commissioner, acting commissioner...
No, but in Norman's situation, Norman was giving an example of where he was given an order by a superior, and he said, "No, I'm not following the order. No,
when you're a
I'm
police
doing my own
officer,
thing." How's that safe?
Stephen, when you're a police officer, let me tell you this: a police officer is the only job in Britain where every single person is a manager. I am the boss of my actions. If a senior officer, or that above my rank, tells me to do something and I disobey that order, and I've done it because as the oath of constable, I believed I was protecting the public or preventing a crime, I would face that discipline board. And the other thing is if I was using my baton or one of the guns or whatever we use, the tasers, I would prefer to stand in front of a jury at the Old Bailey or a Crown Court rather than have my life or that of a member of the public put at risk. That's why so few police officers who do disobey orders are ever disciplined or put in front of a court.
I think Norman's probably talking about a situation where there was a risk to him, and a senior officer said, "Don't do it," and Norman went, "Nah, I'm going to do it anyway." And you know, I've been there as a sergeant, I've been there as an inspector, and you know, I've said to officers, "Don't jump in the water, don't do this, don't do that," and they've gone, "Governor, I'm doing it anyway," and they've done it. And you know, you just roll your eyes and go, "Okay, fair enough." You know, you're braver than the brave. You know, a senior officer present when Wayne Marquez waded in at London Bridge, and the off-duty Charlie Ganigol waded in at London Bridge would have said, "Don't even think about it. You're going into a fight you can't win," and you know, they would have still gone. Listen, and so that's slightly different scenario, Steve.
Okay. Listen, thanks for taking the questions tonight. I think it's a really interesting conversation, and hopefully you both know that I think I do think it was my role tonight and is my role to provide a degree of balance. It doesn't mean that you're not entitled to hold your very strong views, and I think one of the most powerful things that you've both said, Peter and Norman, tonight is, you know, I'm sitting in the comfort of a radio studio. You two have been there and you've done it. And you've been on the ground. So thank you very, very much for your comments tonight. Appreciate you coming on. Here's the number, 03030